Zorian woke up very early in the morning, roused from his slumber by the faint, incoherent mumbling of Kiriel sleeping beside him. For a moment he wondered why Kiriel was sleeping in his bed instead of being in her own room, but then he snapped out of the confused half-dream state he was in and memories of the previous evening came rushing into him. Ray and her husband were dead, their daughter missing. An event that had completely blindsided Zorian, who had never heard of anything like that happening in the previous restarts. Was this something that usually happened and he just never heard of it, or did the many changes in the wake of the Iranian destruction somehow cause this? That fact that Ray and Saw had been killed by a wandering monster seemed to suggest the latter, but Zorian had a hunch there was nothing random about that monster attack. The cephalic rats had been monitoring the Sashal household for a reason, after all, and the invaders were ever so fond of slaving dungeon denizens to their will and using them as their attack dogs. Kiriel, of course, neither knew nor cared about Zorian's musings on the matter. Unlike him, who was not terribly close to the Sashal family and for whom their deaths would in no way be permanent, Kiriel had gotten very close to Nachka and was devastated to hear about the attack. Not even pointing out that she may still be alive could get her to stop crying. After all, the police said her parents were killed by a dungeon denizen, and those weren't exactly known for kidnapping people and keeping them alive for ransom. In the end, Kiriel only calmed down and went to sleep when Amaya gave her some homemade calming tea that kicked in suspiciously quickly. Probably a mild opiate. He should have asked for a cup of that himself. In all likelihood he had already been rather unnerved by his experience of reading the cultists' memories, and was thus ill-equipped to deal with this brand new crisis. Moving slowly, Zorian carefully extricated himself out of his bed and vacated the room, trying not to wake up Kiriel. He was pretty sure he failed in that regard, as her mental signature abruptly got more active about halfway through his retreat from the room, but since she never said anything and kept her eyes closed, he figured she didn't want to talk to him yet. Or maybe she just wanted to go back to sleep. It was pretty early. He found everyone else already awake and seated around the table when he entered the kitchen. See Amaya, Kale and even Kana. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Kale asked rhetorically. Poor thing, Amaya said. She was hit the hardest by this, I think. It's a disgrace that something like that could happen in the middle of the city, and after it was already known that monsters were getting unusually aggressive too. Amaya spent the next 10 minutes or so blaming the city for poor handling of the monster crisis, a subject that she never showed all that much of an interest in before now. It didn't take an empath to figure out that Kiriel wasn't the only one greatly affected by the killings. She had probably formed a friendship with Ray during the many times she had brought Nachka to meet with Kiriel. Kale and Kana, on the other hand, seemed far less affected. Kale had virtually no interaction with either Nachka or Ray, and had never even met Saw, so that was understandable. Kana had sometimes joined Nachka and Kiriel in their games, but had been nowhere near as close to Nachka as Kiriel had. She was also very young and probably didn't quite understand what was happening. Eventually Amaya ran out of steam and fell silent, though Zorian could still feel a lot of frustration coming off her. An uneasy atmosphere descended on the table. Oh yes, Amaya said suddenly. I forgot to tell you yesterday, but the police want to talk to you about Ray and her family. Me? Asked Zorian in surprise. What would I know about that? You did speak to Ray and her husband relatively recently, pointed out Kale. They probably want to see if they told you something of importance. Most likely they want to talk to everyone who knew the victim. I see, Zorian said, idly drumming his fingers on the table. Are they going to drop by at some point or should I go visit the police station? Detective Etc. said he was going to be at the Sashal residence at noon today, and that you should meet him there if possible, Amaya said. Zorian frowned. Etc. That sounded familiar. Where did he his old divination teacher had that last name too, didn't he? And he was a detective, too. This detective Etc. He wouldn't be named Hazlush, would he? Asked Zorian. I think that was his name, yes, Amaya said, frowning. I have to say I don't really remember his introduction all that well. I was too shocked to really pay attention. Why, do you know him? I've heard of him, said Zorian. It's not really important, I was just curious. I'll go give him a visit later. At that point Kiriel trudged into the kitchen, apparently having decided not to go back to sleep after all, and they all wordlessly decided to shelve the topic of the Sashel family for the moment. The Sashel family home didn't look like a scene of death. That was the first thing Zorian noticed when he approached the house. He had expected to see some kind of damage on the building, see broken windows, the door torn off its hinges, maybe a damaged wall section C, but the house looked entirely intact. If it weren't for the trio of policemen hanging around the entrance and giving him severe looks as he approached, he would have never guessed the occupants had been killed. Didn't look much like a monster attack to him. The chance of this being an actual random event kept getting lower and lower. I'm here to speak to Detective etc., he said to the tall, mustachioed, stern-looking policeman that looked like he was the leader of the group in front of him. He told me I should look for him here. Is he present? He's inside, the man nodded. But I'm afraid I can't let you go look for him yourself. If you are willing to wait a little, I will notify him you're here. I'm fine with that, said Zorian, though internally he wasn't happy. He had wanted to take a look inside the place to see if he could spot any clues. He doubted the police would be willing to tell him any details about the killings, after all. Inconvenient. He could just wait until they left the place alone and sneak in then, but that might take several days. See, most of the clues would have gone cold by then, assuming they hadn't been confiscated by the police as evidence. Besides, there wasn't all that much time left before the end of the restart, so his window of opportunity to conduct an investigation was very small. Damn it, he so didn't need this right now. Wait here, then, the mustachioed policeman said. What is your name, boy? Zorian gave him his name, and the man promptly disappeared through the door to fetch Haslash. After 5 minutes of waiting in uncomfortable silence while the other two policemen gave him suspicious looks, however, he could tell it would take a while for the man to return. Zorian shuffled in place uncomfortably, probably looking mightily suspicious to the two policemen scrutinizing his every move. He knew it wasn't entirely rational, but he was profoundly unnerved about being so close to law enforcement. Logically speaking, they had no reason to suspect him of anything, and this entire talk was likely just a formality. He'd had bad dealings with the police back in Siren, though, and he was also dealing with Haslash. His old teacher could be scarily perceptive at times. Zorian wouldn't put it past the man to notice something strange about him and bring him in for more detailed questioning, which would be a gigantic waste of time at best, and at worst would necessitate an early end to the restart via suicide. He'd prefer to avoid the latter possibility at all costs. Kiriel was already devastated about losing a friend, so having her brother suddenly blow himself up in the police station all of a sudden would be terrible. True, Zorian wouldn't be there to see her anguish, and the restart would end a few days later, but just imagining the possibility made him ill. Maybe he should read Haslash's mind. Haslash was probably trained in detecting and resisting mental intrusion, being a mage working for law enforcement and all, but Zorian's particular brand of mind magic was very non-standard. He didn't use any obvious chants and gestures, so maybe he could get away with it. It would probably answer a lot of questions and would allow him to avoid any obvious blunders while talking to him. But no, that was too much of a risk. Besides, he had a much better target for something like that standing just beside him. He doubted those mundane policemen were trained in dealing with mind magic, beyond maybe being given a few pointers. A secret is only as strong as its weakest links. He proceeded to worm his way into the two policemen's thoughts. He found out that they were really not as interested in him as he had been imagining, but they also weren't thinking about the Sashel family. Either one of them was hungry and thinking of the dinner his wife was making him back home, and the other was fantasizing about some female administrative employee back in the station. Well, that was okay. He would talk to them and lead their thoughts back to the situation at hand. So, I don't want to get you gentlemen in trouble or anything, but is there anything you can tell me about what happened here? Saw and Ray had been friends of mine and I was shocked to hear what happened to them. Is there anything you can tell me about all this? Zorian didn't really expect them to say much. He fully expected them to give him the silent treatment until Hazlush got outside, but simply mentioning the topic was usually enough to get a person to start thinking about it. He didn't expect to be hit by a veritable wave of distrust and derisiveness coming from his link to one of the policemen, though. And he looked like such a normal-looking kid, too, the man thought to himself. I'd never have guessed he was hanging around a bunch of thieving cat shifters. Just shows you can never trust outward appearances when it comes to magic bullshit. Ray was a cat shifter. Ha! That made a lot of sense, actually explained some things. What he didn't understand at all was that the policeman seemed to think this made Ray and her family bad people so much so that Zorian was apparently bad just for associating with them. Apparently he had physically reacted to this revelation, because the other policeman noticed it and spoke up to forestall any possible unpleasantness. He didn't seem to see Zorian's reaction as any evidence of mind reading, chalking up his reaction to him being able to sense the change in his partner's bearing and facial expression. We're just here to look tough and discourage curious neighbors from snooping around, kid, the other policeman said. We don't know anything more about this than you do. In all likelihood some sort of dungeon creature made its way into the house and killed the couple inside. For anything more you'll have to wait for Officer Kalen to come back with the detective. The first policeman lightly shook his head before catching himself and stopping. The creature that killed them simply sauntered in through an unlocked door instead of breaking in and attacked absolutely no one else in this entire crowded neighborhood. If that was an actual monster incursion, I will eat my own shoes, the man thought to himself. The kiddies probably stuck their noses in some shady business, like usual, and got offed for it when someone took offense. Gods know they got their paws on everything these days. Zorian frowned. What about Nachka? Their daughter? I was told her body was never recovered and that she might still be alive. The two policemen suddenly became very uncomfortable. Even the first one, who clearly didn't like cat shifters as a whole, felt bad about the little girl who reminded him of his own daughter. Neither of them thought there was much chance of Nachka ever being found again, but they were unsurprisingly unwilling to tell this to Zorian and instead tried to think of a suitable non-answer they could give him. They both breathed a sigh of relief when their exchange was interrupted by the arrival of their mustachioed friend who exited the house with Hazlush in tow. Hazlush, for his part, decided to lead Zorian on a walk away from the house, ruining his plan to keep mind-reading the mundane policeman while they talked for additional clues. It might be for the better, actually paying attention to two different thought streams at the same time had already been rather hard. Trying to have a conversation with Hazlush while doing the same would have probably been impossible. So, Zorian, I can call you Zorian, right? Hazlush asked. Zorian nodded, aware that the man had a massive dislike for formality. Right. I'm guessing Miss Kuroshka has told you what happened back there, but just so we're clear, Ray and Saw Satchel were found dead in their home yesterday morning, along with the mangled corpses of two giant centipedes. Their daughter was nowhere to be found, and nobody has heard anything about her since. Any of that news to you? Mr. Tveranov and Miss Kuroshka already told me most of that, but not the part about the mangled centipedes, said Zorian. Yes, well, your younger sibling reacted so badly to the news that I censored myself a little. Called it a monster attack rather than dwelling on the details, Hazlush shrugged. I apologize for upsetting her so much. I'm told I can be a little tactless at times, but it's a hard trait to lose. This line of work tends to make you more than a little bit morbid, and I sometimes forget most people aren't exposed to death and crime every waking moment of their lives. Zorian thought about assuaging the man's worry and assuring him he didn't hold a grudge about that, but then figured the man would be more willing to share information with him if he appeared guilty, so he remained silent. Instead, he shifted the topic back to the killings. So they were killed by giant centipedes, asked Zorian. I didn't see any damage outside the house. How did they get in? Through the door. Apparently the occupants had left it unlocked. Zorian gave Hazlush an incredulous look. I'm just telling you what we found, Hazlush said defensively. I know this case is strange, it's why we haven't pronounced it closed and moved on. And on that note, is there anything you could tell me about the Sashel family that would explain what happened to them? Of course he did, but nothing he could tell the man without getting himself in trouble. He told Haslush everything he had figured out about the apparent cat shifters through his interactions with them, but this was very sketchy information, and based on Haslush's unhappy expression probably wasn't anything new to the detective. Not that surprising, Amaya alone had probably told him everything Zorian just did and then some. This wasn't really a monster attack, was it? Zorian asked. Haslush gave Zorian a piercing look, which Zorian met unflinchingly. After a few seconds, Haslush withdrew a hip flask from his jacket, took a long, deep sip from it and then put it back into his jacket pocket. No, probably not, he admitted. Why were they targeted and by whom, if you don't mind me asking? Zorian said, trying his luck. Hey, who knows? Maybe the man would even answer. Well now. If I knew that, I wouldn't be speaking to you now, would I? Haslush pointed out. So you have no leads, Zorian concluded. I have too many leads, Haslush corrected. The Sashels, well, how much do you really know about them? I presume you're talking about them being cat shifters. Zorian guessed. Ah, so you do know about that. I've been wondering about that. The rest of your housemates didn't seem aware of that fact, but Amaya said you were unreasonably suspicious of Ray right from the start. Well, if you know what they are, then you surely know why this could be any number of things. I don't, actually, said Zorian, shaking his head in denial. I was suspicious about Ray because she looked suspicious and I am a paranoid person. Them being cat shifters never factored into it, and to be frank I know virtually nothing about them. What's the deal with cat shifters anyway? Bluntly put, most cat shifters are heavily involved with crime, Haslush said. Theft, smuggling and spying, usually, but occasionally even assassination. Their alternate forms are tailor-made for such shady activities, after all. Cats are small, stealthy animals whose presence is hardly ever notable in and of itself. How many new, never seen them before cats do you see in a week? A lot. Right. In a big city like this, unfamiliar cats are ubiquitous. Few things threaten them aside from humans, and most humans don't hurt cats without reason. And on top of that, shifters get the ability to access traits of their animal form even while they're human, meaning cat shifters get things like night vision, a sense of smell powerful enough to put most dogs to shame, superior balance and agility, and a whole bunch of other benefits. I'm still a bit surprised this lets them be so active in crime, said Zorian. You'd think the sheer flexibility of classical mages employed by the various police forces would allow them to shut down a shifter group operating like that, regardless of their special abilities. Ah, but you're assuming cat shifters work alone, which is not the case at all. They are hands down the most firmly assimilated shifter type of them all. They live in cities and towns among ordinary people, and are virtually indistinguishable from a normal human on casual inspection. Everything a regular citizen could do, cat shifters can as well. In particular, this means they have no problems in getting classical magic of their own. Hell, their links to crime mean they can get their hands on many things an average mage can't, like permanent enhancement rituals or illegal spells for evading notice and influencing people. Do you have any evidence that Ray and her family were that type of cat shifter though? Zorian frowned. Maybe I'm naive, but they didn't look like that to me. Surely there are non-criminal cat shifters. There are, Haslush nodded. And every single cat shifter would have you believe they're one of them. Considering what happened, I don't think I'm willing to put much stock in the Sashel family being such counterexamples. Half an hour later, Haslush decided he'd gotten everything he needed out of Zorian and sent him on his way. Instead of going home, however, Zorian hung back. Once he had confirmed that Haslush was not going back to the scene of the crime, Zorian stealthily went back there in order to do some more fact-finding. There were guards posted in front of the house, but none were inside. Perfect. Zorian didn't dare enter the house himself, afraid that there was some kind of alarm on the house to notify the police of break-ins, but conjuring an ectoplasmic eyeball and sending it inside didn't seem to trip any wards, so he closed his eyes and had his eyeball spy look around the house. The bodies of Ray and Saw were long gone by this time, but it was not hard to figure out where each had died due to all the blood stains. Tragically, Ray seemed to have been killed in front of her daughter's room, trying to keep the attackers away from Nachka. She didn't go down without a fight. The bodies of the two giant centipedes, which the police decided to leave in the house, for some reason, littered the entire area. They had been quite literally torn to pieces, their bodies sliced into sections by some powerful severing attack. In the end, though, it hadn't been enough. The door to Nachka's room was smashed open, the only door in the house to have been dealt with so destructively. Her bed flipped over, and Nachka herself nowhere to be found. Zorian had been harboring a hope that maybe Nachka had turned into a cat when the attack had come and then escaped into the night, but that didn't seem likely anymore. It was beyond obvious now that Nachka had been taken by the attackers for some reason. Half an hour later, not having found anything similarly notable, he was ready to call it a day and go home. That's when he searched the place where Ray had died again, and noticed something interesting on the severed head of one of the centipedes. Faintly carved into the chitin of one of the forward sections of the centipede was a very familiar symbol, a circle with an archaic Icosian pictogram for heart inside of it. It wasn't the official symbol used by the esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon, but it was one of the several secret signs that their lower order cultists used to signal other members of their membership. After inspecting the rest of the centipede parts and failing to find anything else significant, Zorian let the eye dissolve and walked away. So his initial suspicion was right, this wasn't some shady deal coming back to haunt Ray and her family, it was connected to the invasion somehow. Admittedly, Zorian had no idea how, but he knew where he could find that out. The cult of the World Dragon was going to get a lot more visits from Zorian in the coming days. After that day, Zorian's daily schedule changed completely. Kiriel lost all interest in magic and no longer attended the lessons he had organized for her, and he decided to free some more time by dropping his membership in Taven's group and skipping most of his classes. He spent most of this extra time planning and executing attacks on known members of the cult of the World Dragon, trying to find out what they did with Nachka. He attacked them incessantly, hitting 2 or more locations a day, and ruthlessly memory probed every cultist he disabled in those excursions. He learned some interesting things doing that. For instance, while Sudamir Kandriai, the mayor of Nyazov Dveri, was indeed a member of the cult, he was a very independent-minded one, to the point that the cult was very annoyed with him. They seemed to have no idea he was killing soul mages around his town, nor did he have any links to the Abasins. As far as they knew, the man promised to give his flocks of iron beaks and hordes of winter wolves to the cult of the World Dragon, not to the invaders as a whole. Zorian supposed he might be in contact with the Abasins on his own initiative, but it was equally possible that his soul mage killing practices were his own thing. What he hoped to accomplish with that, Zorian could only guess. He also found some emergency resource caches that the cult scattered around the city, its underworld, and surrounding villages. They looked very stealable. He made himself a note, a real written note, seeing as how he could now effectively take a notebook with him to the next restart to search through those in some future restart for anything interesting or easy to sell for some quick cash. When it came to locating Nachka, however, his successes had been underwhelming. He managed to track down the group that kidnapped her, but they had simply been following orders and had long since handed her off to another group. He then tracked down that group too, but they no longer had her either and also didn't know who had her now. He had dived deeply and aggressively into their memories, shattering their minds beyond repair, but to no avail. The man they handed Nachka to was a total unknown to them, other than being a high-ranking member of the cult, and they had absolutely no idea where she might have ended up in. Truthfully, Zorian had already suspected that kidnapping Nachka had been the whole point of the attack on the Sashal family, so his findings weren't a huge surprise. The fact that the order had come from the very top of the cult indicated they considered it to be of critical importance. They also told both groups that Nachka had to be delivered alive and unharmed to the transfer point, forbidding abuse under the pain of death, which was also fairly strange. Why? Why did they want Nachka so badly, and why was her continued health so important? He suspected the answer was something in line with, she's their sacrifice to the primordial to wake him up. Demon summoning often involved ritual killings, so it wouldn't surprise him much if unbinding a primordial required the same. Still, why Nachka in particular? Because she was a shifter. The cultists did refer to the primordial as among other names heat of the flowing flesh, which could indicate an ability to change its physical form. There were other shifters in the city, though. Other cat shifters, even. He didn't think he could get to the bottom of this by the end of the restart. If he had another week, maybe, but the restart was near its end and the cult of the World Dragon was getting more paranoid in the face of his constant assaults on them. They'd already tried to set up an ambush for him the last time he tried to attack a location, and only his ability to read people's surface thoughts kept him from stumbling into it and getting himself killed. He wasn't going to get much from them in the 2 days he had left before the summer festival. Although, as horrible as Nachka's kidnapping was, it could prove to actually be a huge opportunity for him, so long as it happened predictably in every restart. If he could place some kind of tracker on Nachka, she could lead him to the highest echelons of the cult of Dragon, those who had stayed well hidden from him up until now. Also, if she really was intended as a sacrifice like he suspected, she could lead him to the place where the cult intended to perform their unbinding ritual, which could be a key to a lot of mysteries surrounding the cult's actions, perhaps even the time loop itself. He would have to wait and see how events would play out in the next restart. Can we talk? Zorian looked away from the novel he was reading and glanced towards Kiriel, who was currently standing on the doorway, nervously gripping one of the support beams. Strange. Kiriel had been very subdued and asocial ever since Nachka had disappeared, rarely ever bothering him anymore, so her approaching him like this was quite unexpected. Sure, he agreed easily. He wasn't doing anything important at the moment, anyway. He was supposed to be organizing his notebooks so he could store the latest blueprints in his mind, but he just didn't feel like doing that at the moment and was instead procrastinating with some light reading. He could spare some time for his little sister. What is it? She ran up to him and, before he could tell her to stop, hurled herself on top of him. As he was currently lying on his bed, she ended up basically reenacting what had long become a very familiar scene to Zorian. Damn it, Kiri, I get enough of that crap at the beginning of each loop, thought Zorian, but refrained from actually saying it out loud. Kiriel was already shaken up, no need to snap at her when she finally decided to open up a little. Where are your shoes? He asked instead. Don't tell me you've been walking around the house barefooted again. Kiriel glanced at her feet and gave him a guilty look. Don't be like Mom, Zorian. It was only one time. You're doing it right now, too, Zorian pointed out. Okay, 2 times, she said, pouting. He put a bookmark into his novel, laid it aside, pushed her off of him and rose in a sitting position. She immediately mimicked him, sitting on the end of his bed beside him. They sat like that in silence for a while, Kiriel dangling her bare feet over the floor and staring at her toes like they were the most fascinating thing in the world. I'm sorry, she finally said. What are you sorry for? Asked Zorian, surprised. For being difficult. Difficult? Asked Zorian incredulously. He peered into her mind for a moment and found her thinking about Mother. Ugh. Yeah, that did kind of sound like something their mother would say. She never did like crying much. One of the few things she praised him for was that he rarely cried, even as a young child. Kiri, you lost your friend. It's okay to be sad about that. You weren't being difficult at all. But you've been avoiding me all week, she mumbled. I wasn't avoiding you, he protested, aghast that she would even think that. I was just giving you some space to grieve in peace. You know. And besides, I was. She gave him a curious look when he didn't continue. You were what? Should he tell her? I was trying to find Nachka, he finally admitted. Her eyes widened at this. You were is that you should have told me. I didn't want to get your hopes up, Zorian said. I was hoping anyway, she said, gripping the sheets tightly in her little fists. He put an arm around her shoulder and pulled her into an embrace. She was still tense, but gradually relaxed after a while and returned his hug. I didn't find her, he admitted after a while. Well, obviously, she said, as if it was the most self-evident thing ever. But you tried. You knew you probably weren't going to find her, and you still went out and searched for her. You didn't cry and mope around the house all day like I did. Kiri, you're 9, Zorian sighed. What else could you have done? You're being way too hard on yourself. She didn't say anything to that. Eventually he decided to just spend some time playing cards with her and praising her drawings. Which did cheer her up in the end, so he chalked that up as one of his better ideas. One of these days, once he mastered the alteration spell he was using to transfer notes into subsequent restarts sufficiently, he should gather some of her artwork into an art book of some sort and copy it into the next restart. Showing her the drawings she herself had made in previous restarts was bound to produce some amusing reactions. You done yet? Zorian asked the other boy. Kale ignored him for a moment, staring at some passage in the book in front of him, but then shook his head and pushed it away from him, massaging his eyes. Yes, I'm done, he said. He pointed at the notebook placed on top of a large stack of books. The notebook is there. Everything is ready on your end? Mostly, Zorian said. I still have to write down some stuff I found out today. Kale raised an eyebrow at him. I thought you said you were taking a break from the cult today. I did, Zorian said. Doesn't mean I did absolutely nothing, though. Oh. Basically, I was thinking about warding, and how the upper-level cultists all lived in warded houses that were a pain to break into, and was thinking of how to speed the process up. And then I remembered that there is not only already a type of tool to do that present on the black market, I actually know where to find one for free. The Urania had stolen a ward scanner from one of the invaders a while before the start of the time loop, and the device was surely still in the destroyed colony. You said you don't like going there, Kale noted. I don't, Zorian sighed. The place it has too many bad memories. And the corpses of the Urania are literally scattered all over the place, so it's hard to go there and not be reminded of that whole fiasco that saw them destroyed. I still think they were somehow ejected from the time loop rather than soul-killed, Kale said. I agree with what other people told you, souls are indestructible. There has got to be a trick there. Yes, well, time travel is supposed to be impossible too, Zorian pointed out. Though I'll admit that I'm hoping you're right. Never mind that for the moment, the point is that I went there to find the ward scanner and I couldn't find it. So? Kale asked. So, that means that either somebody already took it or that there is some secret part of the Uranian complex that I'm unaware of. And frankly, I think it's the latter. I mean, once I thought about it a little, the sheer emptiness of the Uranian settlement was very suspicious. The Sciorian web was very wealthy and surely had a sizable treasury. The matriarch often implied they have some kind of storage full of trade items and such. But I never saw anything like that when I checked the settlement out earlier, probably because I was very uncomfortable there and in a hurry to leave. You think there is something important there? Time loop related? No, probably not, Zorian admitted. But I need every advantage over Red Robe I can get, and there could be a lot of useful stuff there. Who knows what the Urania have squirreled away over the years? True, Kale agreed, rising from his seat and popping his spine. Well, I'm tired. I think I'll go to sleep now. Is there anything else we need to talk about? There's nothing pressing I can think of, Zorian said, shaking his head. I see. Just so you know, I'll be taking Kana with me on a trip to a nearby village on the day of the summer festival. I don't really want to be in Scioria when the invasion comes, and I'm even less enthused about Kana being caught up in the invasion. I understand. I'm glad. If you want, I can take Kiriel with me, said Kale. I know you've been agonizing about what to do with her for a while now. Yeah, agreed Zorian. I don't want to leave her alone for the invasion, but at the same time I need to be able to move freely if I am to investigate what's happening with the invasion after all these changes. You think she'll agree to go with you? I don't know, that's up to you, Kale shrugged. All I can do is make an offer. Fine, I'll talk to her, Zorian sighed. That'll be a lovely talk, I can already tell. Notify me what you decided by tomorrow evening, said Kale. And just like that, the restart was already almost done. Tomorrow he would see how the invasion of the city proceeded this time around. Zorian looked over his things, trying to remember if he had forgotten something crucial in his rush to finish the preparations in time. He couldn't think of anything, but it would be just like him to forget something blindingly obvious while worrying about the irrelevant minutiae. He still had several hours to burn until the start of the invasion, however, so he left the preparations alone for now and left his room to find some quick diversion. Remembering that Amaya kept a whole miniature library of exotic works in her house, he set off to browse its shelves in search of a good time waster. He found Amaya already there, though, staring at her collection with a faraway look. Miss Koroshka, he asked worriedly. He was getting some worrying feelings from her with his empathy. Are you all right? She mumbled, before her brain rebooted again and she truly focused on his presence. Oh, Zorian. How long have you been standing there? I only just came here. Been looking for a book to pass the time with, but you looked. Don't worry, she sighed. I'm just disturbed by the sudden quiet in the house. It looks so lonely. Ha. I thought you'd be glad to have some peace and quiet for a change, Zorian said. She snorted. I think you're projecting your own attitude here a little, she said. Probably, admitted Zorian. He always did like to have some space from everybody else, and would have probably welcomed a situation like this in her place. But Kale and the girls are only gone for one day, so it's hardly a big deal. You could have gone with them, you know. I know. But if there really is rioting during the festival, like you said there might be, I don't want to leave my house to the looters. It's the only thing I have left. Oh. Sorry, getting a little personal there, she smiled. Is there any particular book you were looking at? There was a loud knock on the front door. Amaya and Zorian both raised their eyebrows at each other. Apparently neither of the two knew who might be coming for a visit in this time of day. Most people were getting ready to attend the summer festival somewhere, either at some friend's house or some other venue. Amaya hurried towards the door to see who it was. There was a brief pause where Amaya had a brief exchange with whoever was at the door, after which Amaya called out at Zorian to join them. Zorian, your date is here, she yelled. My date? He asked incredulously, more to himself than to anyone else. How could he have a date when he didn't? She didn't. But she totally did. As he came to the front door to see what Amaya was talking about, the frowning face of Akoja greeted him from the doorframe. Hello, AKO, Zorian said blandly. What a surprise to see you here. I suppose Ilsa had something to do with this. Yes, she fumbled, her composure breaking for a bit. Miss Salady told me to accompany you to the dance, since we are both without a partner. Now wasn't that interesting? How the hell had Ilsa known that? True, Zorian had no date for the dance, and in fact had no intention of attending the academy dance at all, but she shouldn't have been aware of that. Zorian had never told her anything to that effect, nor did he hint at that to anyone except Amaya. Damn. He gave his landlord a dirty look before refocusing back on Akoja. This was not part of the plan. He was supposed to roam around the city, observing the invaders in action and noting the changes to their tactics as a result of the various changes arising from the destruction of the Arania and that unfortunate mercenary band he'd hired to participate in the ambush. Sometimes he hated his empathy. Without it, he would never have known just how much this meant for Akoja and how hard blowing her off to do his own thing would hit her. We still have several hours before we have to be at the dance hall. Come inside and wait with Amaya for a bit while I run some urgent errands in the city, he said. What? She stammered, confused, as Zorian squeezed past her through the door and began walking into the city. Wait, you can't just dash. Zorian quickly cast the teleport spell and let the city's teleport beacon draw him into Cyoria's teleport access point. He had lots of work to do and only so much time to execute it. What were you in such a hurry for, earlier? Akoja asked as they slowly made their way towards the academy. She was surprisingly calm and polite, all things considered. Zorian had thought she'd be more annoyed at him because of his emergency exit earlier. I had something already arranged before you arrived. I had to take care of some things when you came knocking at Amaya's door, Zorian said. Cancel some things and adjust others. Specifically, he was placing marker stones in various parts of the city to make scrying easier. Watching the invasion forces move through the city was not quite the same as ambushing isolated battle groups and rooting through their mines, but at least it was something. Maybe it was better this way. His original plan was kind of ambitious. Possibly too ambitious. As they talked, Akoja told him a little about how the rest of his classmates handled the changes to the restart. It was mostly just idle chat, though it did remind him that he hadn't paid much attention to his class in this restart. There was just so much to do in this particular restart that interaction with his classmates sort of fell by the wayside. Considering that one of his motivations for coming back to Cyoria had been to see and talk to them again, that was something that should probably be remedied in the near future. The night proceeded far more smoothly than the last one where he'd had Akoja as his date. She seemed to have far more respect and concern for his wishes this time around, though Zorian couldn't for the life of him figure out why. In some ways he had actually been a bigger jerk now than he had back then. Regardless, once the flares started hitting the city, he snuck away from her and started scrying the city for information. The initial barrage of artillery spells was different this time around. While the old artillery barrage used by the invaders specifically targeted critical buildings whose destruction was calculated to send the city into chaos and cripple its ability to organize a defense, the new barrage was uninspired. Oh, they still targeted the central police station, the city hall, and other obvious targets, but things like backup government buildings and armories were left intact. In fact, a lot of the flares seemed to have been aimed completely at random, demolishing unremarkable clusters of houses and civilian apartments, something that would admittedly greatly increase the number of deaths in the invasion, but was of questionable strategic benefit. Bizarrely, every single temple in the city was the target of at least one flare. Zorian had no idea what the invaders were trying to accomplish there, and it definitely wasn't something they did in their previous invasion plan. The fights around the city were far fiercer than they had been in Zorian's previous restarts. Partly it was due to the defenders being in a lot better shape this time around, courtesy of the invasion's poor choice of targets for their initial strike, but there was more to it than that. The invasion forces seemed a lot less coordinated than he remembered them being. They moved a lot less purposefully through the city and often blew off their apparent goals to rampage through the undefended civilian neighborhoods. That happened sometimes in the past as well, but never in such high numbers. As far as the initial attack on the academy went, the invaders chose their actions there just as poorly as they did elsewhere. The new barrage targeted the academy building directly instead of aiming for the less well-defended dormitories and support buildings like the old barrage did. Consequently, the flares simply splashed harmlessly off the heavy wards protecting the main complex, doing minimal damage. With no need to render aid and run damage control in the peripheral part of the academy, the teachers were free to keep their forces concentrated and organized the evacuation of the student body and other non-combatant employees much more competently than they had before. Funny, he originally thought the academy was massively incompetent for leading the students into massive underground death traps, especially since that involved going over vast swathes of open ground where they would be completely exposed. They didn't look so dumb right now. The evacuation went off without a single problem, and no one attacked them when they were shoved inside the shelters. Zorian was pretty sure at this point that he was looking at what the invasion was really like, what it would look like had Red Robe never given them any help. When he really thought about it, most of their mistakes could be chalked up to being far less well-informed and lacking the ability to bypass every ward and defense they encounter because they've been either keyed into them or knew how to counter it quickly. It would appear that Red Robe really did abandon the invaders in this restart, right down to the very end. Was this a one-time thing, or did Red Robe suddenly decide not to meddle in the invasion anymore? His musings were interrupted by Ilsa coming to the shelter and demanding that every combat-capable student come with her to defend the academy. Thanks to him participating in monster hunts with Taven's group, that included him as well, so he got up from his spot on the floor and joined the group of students following her outside. There, he saw what had gotten Ilsa so concerned that she was recruiting students as defenders. The invaders were massing just outside the academy wards, preparing for an all-out assault. Entire regiments of war trolls, winter wolves and skeletons were present there, supported by their mage handlers and thick flocks of razor beaks. More unusually, there were a couple of flying drakes mixed in among the deadly corvids, and 2 bulky, elephant-sized lizards stalked in front of the miniature army. Thunder lizards, Ilsa said distastefully from beside him. Immensely tough and very destructive. They can breathe arcs of electricity in a straight line in front of them, so try not to fight them from the front if you are forced to engage them at all. Lovely. He never saw those in any previous restarts. Maybe this was something they never felt like committing to the battlefield because they never felt they needed them. But the time for considering such things was over. Although clearly not fully assembled for attack, the commander of the monstrous horde urged his forces to charge ahead. Maybe he felt that waiting for the rest of the forces would be a bad move since the academy defenders were busily fortifying their positions, or maybe he was just impatient. Either way, they surged ahead, thunder lizards leading the charge. Zorian knew he could offer very little by simply pouring some more offensive spells into the attacking horde along with the rest of the defenders, but he had a better idea anyway. Focusing on the 2 thunder lizards, he felt their simplistic minds and was overjoyed to find out that they were far less magically resistant than he had feared. He suspected that might be the case. The invaders were probably controlling those things with mind magic to begin with, so it would only make sense that they were not all that resistant to it. Regardless, this meant he could manipulate them. Not to the extent of directing them like puppets, but enough to negate their attacks. Sure enough, when the lizards started approaching the makeshift barricades that the teachers had made out of the ground via alteration spells, the 2 lizards opened their toothy mouths and tried to blow up the barricades with their thunder attack. Zorian quickly seized control of their movements and made them angle their heads towards one another, their thunder attacks colliding with each other's bodies. A surge of anger flooded the minds of the 2 thunder lizards, and they halted their charge in favor of roaring at each other, too dumb to realize their actions were caused by outside influence. Zorian seized on this opportunity, amplifying their wrath and urging them to fight each other, and the 2 of them promptly collided with each other and began fighting to the death. To their credit, the rest of the invading forces simply flowed around the 2 battling behemoths, unconcerned with their failure. The battle was joined. Zorian stared at the battle site full of corpses, more than a little bit dazed. He had been in a fair amount of battles ever since he'd gotten pulled into the time loop, but nothing quite like this. The fight had quickly turned chaotic once the 2 forces seriously started engaging one another, and even now that it was over, Zorian still wasn't sure what exactly happened there. They won in the end, repulsing the attackers. The mages decided to flee when enough of their monster minions got killed, but they lost far more people in the attack than Zorian had thought they would. Zorian himself was surrounded by a pack of winter wolves at one point and only survived thanks to no less than 5 blasting rods he had smuggled into the dance hall with him. Well, that and Kieran's timely arrival with reinforcements to drive the attackers back. He jumped in fright when someone's heavy hand clasped his shoulder suddenly, almost blowing their head off with a reflexive piercer before he realized it was just Kieran. "You're the one that was messing with the heavy hitter monsters during the whole fight, aren't you?" his combat teacher asked. "Yeah," Zorian shrugged. "No need to keep it a secret this close to the end." I felt that was the most effective way of contributing to the battle that I was capable of. Well, that flying drake would have roasted poor Nora alive if you hadn't made it plow into the ground suddenly, so thanks for that. Though we're really going to have to talk about how you learned how to do that and what exactly your limits are. Ha, Zorian snorted. It's far too late for that, I'm afraid. Oh. Kirin asked, a mixture of warning and curiosity in his voice. Yes, Zorian confirmed. He consulted his watch to see what time it was. It was 2 hours and 39 minutes after midnight. I'm afraid this loop is just about to end. Kirin stared at him blankly for a few seconds before opening his mouth to say something. Before he could utter a single word, though, everything went black and Zorian woke up back in Siren, ready to start this month anew. The start of the newest loop differed little from the previous one. He got on the train to Scioria with Kiriel in tow, entertained her with feats of magic as well as disguised, and more than a little embellished, accounts of his own adventures to stave off boredom, and even talked with Ivory for a bit. Just for a bit, though she wasn't terribly interested in him this time, since he'd finished telling stories to Kiriel by the time they stopped at Corsa, and didn't demonstrate any amazing spellcasting skills while she was in the compartment. Here we are, said Zorian, stepping off the train and helping Kiriel finagle her luggage through the train wagon door. It was kind of cute how she insisted she would carry her luggage on her own, but he knew from previous restarts that this resolution wouldn't last very long. Well, whatever, he'd let her live in denial for now. Welcome to Scioria, dearest sister. I'm your only sister, she shot back, curious eyes looking around the massive train station she found herself in. You know I'm telling the truth, then, Zorian said blandly. Kiriel ignored him in favor of studying the colorful storefronts, the huge clock hanging from the train station ceiling, and the flowing masses of people milling around the place. Truth be told, she handled the sight a lot better than Zorian had when he disembarked in Scioria for the first time ever. Big, she concluded eventually. Scioria is a big city and an important transport hub, said Zorian simply. They get lots of traffic. Do you mind if we look around for a bit? Kiriel asked. You mean browse some stores for interesting trinkets? Zorian guessed. She pouted at him. Sure, we can do that. I'm only buying you one souvenir, though, and nothing too ridiculous. What qualifies as too ridiculous? She asked, eyeing the storefront speculatively. Use your common sense, Zorian deadpanned. Like hell was he getting into a definition game with her. And if I'm not sure about something, she prompted. Ask, he immediately fired back. He could probably buy anything she set her eyes on, especially considering he was about to get a massive cash infusion in a few days, but he didn't think it a good idea to encourage her excesses like that. Kiriel had never been very keen on restraint to begin with, and he shuddered to think what would happen if he decided to pander to her whims too much. For the next hour and a half, Zorian simply followed Kiriel around as she flitted from one store to another like a drunken butterfly, following no pattern he could discern. Then again, he didn't really invest much thought into figuring it out. He mostly spent his time practicing his mind sense, trying to process the information he was getting about the crowds around them. Large, closely packed crowds like the ones at Scioria's main train station still tended to ruin his mind sense, reducing the feedback into an incomprehensible, blurry blob of emotions and strange signals. He was getting better at picking specific minds out of that background fog, though. He practiced the procedure by constantly keeping track of Kiriel's mind, turning her into a sort of a telepathic anchor, and then trying to pick out the minds of random people from the crowd to get a better feel for them. It was slow, annoying work, but he was getting sick of having his empathy and mind sense effectively shut down every time he encountered a crowd. She picked a snow globe in the end. Admittedly, it was a very nice snow globe. The little house and the trees inside it were incredibly detailed and well done, almost as if someone had literally shrunk a house and its immediate environs and placed them in a glass sphere. Clearly some fairly sophisticated magic had been used to produce the thing, even if the end product was completely non-magical to his senses, and the globe was priced accordingly, but it was better than Zorian had feared, so he bought it without complaint. Idly, he wondered if his alteration skills were good enough to produce a globe like that. With Kiriel's trinket hunting done, they set off towards the main plaza and its fountain, just like they had in the previous restart. Unlike the previous restart, Zorian took them through the park right from the start. There was really no need for them to meet the cephalic rat swarm. Quite the contrary, it was an unnecessary and unacceptable risk, as Kiriel's mind was completely unshielded and there was always a possibility that the rats could figure something important or attention-grabbing from Kiriel's stray thoughts. As it turned out, that had been a pretty important change. Having never seen the cephalic rats, Kiriel obviously couldn't tell Ray about them, so the topic simply never came up. And apparently he greatly underestimated how much he'd disturbed Ray in their previous first meeting, because keeping quiet about the terrifying mind-reading powers of the rats made Ray a lot less on guard around him this time around, as well as much more insistent about them staying for a while. Humph. He let Ray and Kiriel convince him to delay their departure. As far as he could tell, this was the best moment to find something out from Ray's mind, before she had time to grow suspicious of him, and he had every intention of using it to the hilt. A student of Scioria's Royal Academy? Pretty prestigious place to study at for a boy hailing from a small rural town, if you don't mind me saying, Ray remarked. Not that there is anything wrong with being from a small rural town. We're from one ourselves, after all, but doesn't Scioria's Royal Academy accept only the, only the very talented or the very well-connected, guessed Zorian. It was what most people who weren't personally involved with the institution thought, after all. Seeing Ray nod in agreement, he continued. Not really. The admission process is a combination of how well you do on the entrance exams, whether you receive a recommendation from a member of the academy staff or someone else suitably famous, and whether denying you admission would offend someone particularly powerful and influential. Basically, so long as you can pay the admission fee and do well enough in the entrance exams, you are guaranteed to get in. Is that how you got in? Ray asked curiously. I was in the top 50 based on exam results, said Zorian proudly. He was 48th, but he wasn't going to mention that. Brother is plenty talented, Kiriel said suddenly. But, they probably also accepted him because of our brother Daimen. At least that's what Mother said happened. What? Asked Zorian flatly. Kiriel stammered. Please don't be mad because Mother told me not to tell you this because you would get mad at me, but Mother said you and Fortov were only accepted so easily because Daimen got so big and successful. Daimen had nothing to do with it, Zorian said, grinding his teeth in annoyance. I achieved good enough results that my admission had never been in question. Mother is, like usual, ascribing everything good in the world to Daimen and lumping me with that lout Fortov in order to dash. I believe you, Mr. Kaczynski, Ray interrupted him. Calm down. There is no reason to jump down your little sister's throat like that. Right, sorry, Zorian said, with a little bit more bitterness than he intended. There was a short, awkward silence for a few seconds. Great. Real smooth there, Zorian. Damn it, why did he let this get under his skin like that? So, I'm assuming your brother is that Daimen Kaczynski? Ray asked finally. The famous one? Yes, Zorian sighed. The famous one. Wait, your other brother is famous? Nachka asked Kiriel innocently. What for? Things, Kiriel shrugged uncomfortably, saying nothing else on the topic. Probably trying not to upset him further by continuing the discussion. Daimen is an adventuring archaeologist, Zorian said, doing his best to suppress his annoyance with the whole thing. He leads expeditions to dangerous areas in search of lost artifacts and ruins. Or even rare plants and magical creatures, even though that should technically be outside the purview of archaeology. He has been very successful in this, so he gets a lot of attention from people. There. It was an incomplete explanation, yes, but not really misleading or anything. Hopefully it would suffice. I haven't heard anything about him for more than a year now, Ray remarked. He's in Koth, Zorian said. Apparently he found something very important in the jungle, but he's been very secretive about it. I'm sure you'll hear all about it when he finally deigns to unveil it to the world. Thankfully, the topic of conversation shifted away from Daimen at that point. Zorian decided to take advantage of the somewhat personal nature of Ri's questions to ask about their personal details. Her story was functionally identical to what she told him in the previous restart, but her surface thoughts were far easier to read this time, what with her not being primed to defend her secrets from a swarm of thought-sharing, mind-reading rats. Her surface thoughts told him an interesting story. For one thing, Saw was not a cat shifter. Only Ray and Nachka were. Ray had been a criminal, but then she met Saw and decided to leave that life behind to be with him. How romantic. Except that neither Ri's former associates nor the rest of the townsfolk were willing to let Ray forget what her past was, so the family packed up their things and left to somewhere where nobody knew who they were and where they could start anew. Where Nachka could grow up without her mother's past sabotaging her at every turn. Damn, he was really starting to get mad about what the Cult of the World Dragon had in store for them. He didn't think he could just coldly watch as Nachka's parents are murdered and she herself kidnapped. Though, thinking about it now, it wasn't such a problem in this particular restart. His memory reading was nowhere near good enough yet to get much out of high-ranking cultists, even if he could track them down by following Nachka's movements. And who said he was even capable of preventing her kidnapping in the first place? It wasn't like he had a foolproof plan to stop it. After all, if the kidnapping proceeded under some different schedule than the one in the previous restart, he'd basically have to monitor the Sashel family day and night to intercept it. He decided to put his original plan on hold for now and see how things developed. Who knows, maybe the last restart was a fluke and kidnapping Nachka wasn't something the cultists routinely did in every loop. He would have to put some kind of tracker on her just in case, though. By the time they were done talking, the rain had already started falling outside. Ray tried to argue that they should wait for a while until it lessened, but Zorian knew that wasn't happening for quite a while and refused. He enveloped himself and Kiriel in a weather shield to block the rain and bid the Sashel family goodbye. He considered it a proof of his growing skill and mana reserves that his shield held strong for the entire length of their journey, letting them arrive at Amaya's place completely dry and unwinded. The next few days were fairly routine. He went to Nyazov Dveri to get himself plenty of crystallized mana, sold said crystals in various stores in Syoria for large amounts of cash, accepted Taven's offer of joining her team in running monster-killing missions and tested whether his stored notebooks had survived the restart. They had. With the start of classes on Monday, however, Zorian decided to go out of his comfort zone a little and initiate contact with one of his classmates. Specifically, Rainey. He was currently investigating shifters, after all, and she was supposed to be a wolf shifter herself. Maybe she knew some crucial information. It didn't hurt to ask. There was one big, obvious problem with his idea. However, Rainey got a lot of love confessions and date invitations from her many love-stricken fans, and would probably assume his attempt to talk to her was just more of the same. And she was not interested in love and dating. She made that very clear over the years. How could he ensure his attempt to talk to her wouldn't be misunderstood? He agonized for an entire day over which method of approach he should use, before deciding he was being stupid. So what if she got the wrong idea when he asked to talk to her? Though she categorically rejected every man who tried to court her, her rejections had always been polite and non-violent to his knowledge, except for that one time she punched a guy in the face, but everyone who was there agreed that guy got a little grabbier than was proper. Bottom line was, he could just approach her directly before class and ask for a talk, and the worst that could happen was that she could tell him to get lost without hearing him out. Hardly the end of the world, and with the time loop in place he would have a chance to try again in the next restart with a different approach. The worst didn't happen, though. When Zorian asked to talk to her after class, Rainey simply gave a little sigh and spared a lingering glance at the ceiling, as if asking the gods what she had done to deserve this, before agreeing to his request. The class came and went, and the classroom gradually emptied of people until only Zorian, Rainy and Kiana were left. Why was Kiana there? Hell if Zorian knew, but her presence was clearly not unintended by Rainy, so he opted not to say anything. Did Kiana know about her friend being a shifter? If not, then broaching the topic in front of her was probably not something Rainy would appreciate. How annoying. Sorry about this, Rainy said. I know you probably wanted this to be private, but Kiana insisted on staying behind too, and, well. She shrugged helplessly. She sounded honestly apologetic about it, and if he were incapable of sensing people's emotions, he would have probably believed her too. He gave Kiana a glance, and she quickly straightened her posture and fixed a small scowl on her face. Probably trying to look intimidating or something. Her real emotions were a mix of boredom and impatience, though she probably considered the entire thing a massive chore. Zorian almost cracked a smile at the whole setup. The funny thing was that if he was going to ask anyone out, it would probably be Kiana, not Rainy. He'd kind of had his eyes on her before he'd gotten stuck in this whole time loop business, in an idle, daydreaming sort of way. If he remembered correctly, Zack caught him staring at her once, in that fateful first restart. A part of him wanted to ask Kiana out right now, just to see how the two of them would react to such a development. But no, that would only be amusing for a short while and he would have to live with all the created drama for the rest of the month. Besides, his reasons for liking Kiana were extremely shallow and based entirely around her looks. He felt she was just as beautiful as Rainy, and preferred her black hair to Rainy's red. That was it, really. For all he knew, her personality could be absolutely atrocious. If you're okay with her presence, then so am I, Zorian said. That said, do you mind if I erect a privacy bubble around us? Nielu and company are hanging by the door, trying to eavesdrop, and I think we'd all be happier if they did not hear this. Ugh, Rainy grunted, rising from her seat and marching off towards the door. There is no need for that. I'll be back in a moment. Through his mind sense, Zorian could feel the 4 mental signatures of their eavesdroppers flee before Rainy's approach. They were already halfway down the corridor by the time she opened the door, and in less than a minute Rainy was back in her seat. Well then, she began, now that the spy brigade is gone, we can finally get this over with. What did you want to talk to me about, Mr. Kaczynski? Does Kiana know about shifters? Zorian asked. Evidently she did, if her shocked reaction was any indication. What? Rainy stammered. How do you know about that? I asked a scholar named Vani to tell me about shifters and dash. Vani from Nyazov-Dveri? Rainy asked, interrupting him. Aren't you supposed to be from Siren? I am, Zorian confirmed. That doesn't mean I am forbidden from visiting Nyazov-Dveri on occasion. I have friends there. Of course you have, Rainy sighed. Look Zorian. I kept this a secret for a reason. Zorian nodded in agreement. That's why I asked whether Kiana knows. I know, Kiana piped in, crossing her arms in front of her. And I'll be charitable and assume you'll keep it a secret, just as I have, despite being friends with that blabbermouth Benesek. So what exactly do you want from Rainy anyway? I made acquaintances with a couple of cat shifters, and I wanted to hear an opinion of another shifter about some things related to that, said Zorian. I figured I'd ask Rainy first and see if she was willing to answer some questions. There was a brief silence as both girls digested this. This is way too heavy of a topic for a free period, Rainy decided. Our next class is about to start soon. Well, yes, agreed Zorian. It doesn't have to be now. I just want to know if you're even willing to help me out. I might as well, Rainy said dismissively. My main concern about shifter talk had always been about not wanting people to know I was one to begin with, and the cat is apparently already out of the bag. Besides, if you're hanging out with the likes of cat shifters, you're going to need some advice. No offense to your new acquaintances, but cat shifters tend to be unsavory characters. I did hear some rumors about that, Zorian admitted. So how is this going to work, then? I don't know, Rainey admitted. I'm going to have to think about it. You've ambushed me out of nowhere with this. I'll get back to you when I figure out a time and place. Don't contact us, we'll contact you, Kiana summarized. And then they were out of time and ended the meeting in favor of rushing to the next class. Overall, Zorian was pleased with the outcome even if the looks and whispers of his classmates signified they had noticed the interaction and that the resulting fallout had yet to be determined. Rainey didn't seem to be in a hurry to organize a meeting with him after their talk, but Zorian didn't hold it against her. It was nothing urgent, and he had plenty of things to busy himself with in the meantime. Currently, that meant combing the Arania settlement for any hints regarding where they kept their treasury. He wasn't having much luck yet, but then again he didn't expect to be lucky so soon. It would be a pretty terrible secret treasury if all it took was a single day of dedicated searching to track it down. Zorian wandered the tunnels of the settlement, his mind sense straining in an attempt to detect some surviving Arania hiding somewhere. He didn't find any. The Iranian settlement was a silent tomb, unmoving corpses of giant spiders scattered throughout its expanse and undisturbed by scavengers due to the wards the Arania had placed on it. Occasionally his mind sense detected a mental signature, but it inevitably turned out to be some dungeon denizen trying to sneak past the wards of the settlement or one of the few surviving male Arania. Not that the latter were wholly useless though subsapient, they were still representative of what the Arania were like, and didn't have the mental defenses that female Arania did. Zorian made sure to capture each one he encountered so he could read their minds for information about the location of the treasury, more out of desire to practice his memory reading on something related to Arania than out of any real hope that they knew something. Though he had to say the males were a lot smarter than Zorian had thought they would be, considering what he'd been told by the female Arania. They were actually closer to animals such as ravens and pigs than something dumb like a horse or a dog. 3 of them even worked together in order to ambush him, and Zorian only narrowly avoided getting bitten by the one of them. The Arania were only weakly venomous, according to what he'd been told by them, but he would still rather not tempt fate like that. Damn, Zorian swore. Nothing, not even a clue as to where he should look next. That's it, I'm done with this for today. Kale, you done with your examination yet? Kale shifted his attention from the curled, motionless corpse of some unfortunate Arania towards him, his mind slowly switching gears from his focused work state into something capable of holding a conversation. Oh, that, Kale mumbled. Yes, I checked them over for soul magic ages ago. I can find no traces of any soul magic being performed on them. None whatsoever, and it's honestly freaking me out. If you hadn't told me what really happened, I'd have assumed these bodies to be very sophisticated meat puppets devoid of souls to begin with, not sapient creatures whose souls have somehow been removed. I've just finished a more comprehensive medical scan, however, and there is no way these bodies are meat puppets. I'm baffled. This doesn't look like the aftermath of any soul spell I know of. Damn. He had really been hoping Kale would be able to find something. You really can't tell me anything else? Zorian urged. Anything? No. Well, maybe, Kale said, hesitating. Zorian urged him to continue. While my medical scans show these spiders indeed died on the first day of the restart, they died somewhere after 2 in the morning. Ah, I see where you're going with that, Zorian said after a brief pause. That implies that the time loop starts almost 6 hours before I wake up. Yes, Kale agreed. I'm not sure how useful that is to you, but it's interesting. Very, Zorian agreed. Especially if I can somehow force myself to wake up at the start of the time loop as opposed to when I usually do. Kale nodded and before suddenly checking on his pocket watch. Ah, I didn't even realize so much time has passed. I promised Kana I would take her to the park today, do you think we could dash? He found her in the kitchen, telling stories to Amaya and playing with the miniature golem he'd made for her. Amusingly, no one in the house seemed to realize just how much money and skill it took to create that thing. It was just a fancy magical doll to them, and they barely gave it a second's thought. To Zorian, though, that little golem was very special for one simple reason: he had created the blueprint for it in the previous restart. Although Zorian had spent a lot of time in the restarts messing with spell formula and magic item creation, the truth was that he had been somewhat reluctant to truly sink a lot of his time into the field because he had to effectively recreate his designs purely from memory with every restart. While that was good in a sense, as it forced him to re-evaluate and refine his designs each time instead of relying on tried-and-true designs, the fact of the matter was that it slowed things down to a crawl whenever he was forced to recreate everything from scratch over and over again. He had effectively been limited to fairly simple projects, but now that he could actually transfer notebooks across restarts, he was freed of these limitations and could truly start advancing in the field. He greeted Amaya, announcing his return, and then turned to his little sister. "Hello, Kiri," he greeted. "Are you ready for your magic lesson?" "Yes," she agreed enthusiastically. "So does that mean you read the first 3 chapters of that book I gave you?" Zorian asked. Yeah," she agreed, much less enthusiastically than before. "I may have skipped a few parts." Zorian gave her a knowing look. He had a feeling that if he quizzed her on what she read, he would find she skipped far more than a few parts. "All right," he said, putting a small black cube on the table in front of them. "This here is the mana absorption cube. Its function is very simple: it will absorb any mana you let out, after which the carved lines you see on its surface will begin to glow. It sounds useless, but beginner mages like yourself have trouble sensing their own mana flow, and thus cannot really determine whether their efforts are achieving any results. This will help keep you on target. Later, when you start extruding mana out of your body reliably, we can move on to purposely feeding mana into the cube in order to build greater control." Kiriel took the cube carefully into her hands, as if afraid it was going to bite her, and started tracing the lines carved into its surface with her fingers. "Did you also learn using one of those things?" she asked. "I thought that was done using one of those glass balls you brought home after your second year." "I did, but I discovered those things aren't really the best tool for the job," Zorian said. "They're mass-produced, with an eye for price instead of maximum effectiveness. That cube you're holding in your hand is a bit better than that." "Oh," she said, giving him a surprised look. "Was it expensive?" Well, technically Zorian had produced that cube on his own, but the materials he used weren't exactly cheap. "Yes, but don't worry about it," he said dismissively. "I don't mind spending money on this, so long as you actually take your lessons seriously." "And Kiriel?" "Yeah?" she asked curiously. "You really need to actually read those 3 chapters for our next lesson, and I'd appreciate if you didn't lie to me like that in the future," he said. At least she had the decency to blush in response. The first week of the restart was a pretty big success in Zorian's eyes. True, he never did manage to find the Iranian treasury, but everything else was going along nicely. Red Robe had once again neglected to give any information to the invaders, so they were stumbling around just as badly as they had in the previous restart. This was the second time in a row that he had done that, and that was taking into account just the restarts that Zorian knew about. It had probably started way earlier than this. Did Red Robe completely give up on supporting the invasion after their confrontation? That was more than a little strange, considering how dedicated he'd been about helping them out before. Maybe he supported the invasion primarily as a way to keep Zack busy with something and mask the aftershocks of his own actions. If so, the fact that he revealed himself to Zack would kind of make such trickery pointless. Regardless of the reason, Red Robe's absence made things very convenient for Zorian. The moment he realized Red Robe was once again ignoring the invaders, he immediately launched a series of raids on the known invaders and their cultist allies. He found nothing new yet, but every memory dive he did made him one step closer to opening the Matriarch's memory packet, so he considered himself successful there regardless. He also scouted a couple of the emergency resource caches that he'd found in the last restart, and even looted a particularly badly defended one. That particular cache held nothing except a large quantity of unlabeled potion bottles, which was slightly disappointing. He handed them off to Kale to see if he could figure out what they were and find a use for them. He'd feel bad about taking advantage of the Morlock boys so much, except that Kale actually seemed enthusiastic about all the work Zorian was sending his way, so Zorian figured it was okay. His monster hunts with Taven were more successful this time around as well, since he had knowledge of where the monster nests and main migration routes were from his previous restarts. Taven was ecstatic at their results, though Zorian had noticed her giving him some strange looks when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Did she somehow realize how improbable his claim of divining the locations of the monsters was? Well, no matter, since she never actually confronted him about it, he decided to continue using his foreknowledge to improve results of the hunts and deal with the fallout when, and if, it came. His quest for getting himself a better library pass was also going along nicely, even though it was still in the beginning stages. The method he chose was extremely simple. He hung around the library entrance during its busiest hours and covertly scanned the minds of everyone who entered and left, looking for people with higher passes who weren't regular visitors of the library. After all, while the Academy was stingy about giving higher authorizations to its students, actual holders of higher authorizations weren't exactly rare. Plenty of mages had them, and few of them were using them with any degree of regularity. If he chose his target correctly, they would never even realize their library pass had gone missing. And hopefully, the library would also never realize the holder of the card was not the same person whose name was printed on it. The crowning achievement of this week, however, was the session with Svim he was currently attending. Svim was usually extremely punctual about their sessions, ending them at exactly their mandated time, no more, no less. Today, however, Zorian had been so good about meeting his ridiculous demands that Svim decided to quietly extend their session beyond their allotted time. Zorian said nothing, simply continuing his endless repetition of the tasks Svim gave him, but internally he was smiling. Even if Svim retained his stony facade, the fact he decided to break off from his usual routine told Zorian that he was definitely making progress in unnerving his annoying mentor. Unfortunately, as much as he'd like to see how long Svim intended to keep him here if he did not complain, Zorian had other obligations to fulfill today. A training session with someone else, you say? Svim asked curiously. And what, pray tell, is this training session about, to trump the meeting with your mentor in importance? It's something Professor Zalady arranged for me, Zorian said, invoking the authority of another teacher. I'm meeting another student so we can practice our mind magic together. Svim stared at him for a second. If Zorian had expected some kind of shock at his admission, or a request at confirmation that, yes, he indeed meant mind magic, he was disappointed. Svim just stared at him for a bit, tapped his finger on the table once, and then reached some kind of decision. Why have you not notified me of this sooner? He asked. I meant no offense, sir, Zorian assured him smoothly. It's just that this was our first meeting, and you immediately had me start with shaping exercises when I entered the room. I felt it would be imprudent to interrupt your lesson for such an ultimately irrelevant detail. Humph. And you say you're practicing with another student? The blind teaching the blind, Svim said, shaking his head in disapproval. He then made a dismissive gesture with his hand, shooing him away. Well, then. Go. I'm not going to keep you from your duties. Thank you, sir, Zorian said, rising from his seat. I am to see you on next Friday, then. No, come see me on Monday after classes, Svim said. I need to see this mind magic of yours in action before I can plan for our next session. Ha. Now this he did not expect. Was Svim implying he could help him develop his mind magic somehow? He did have a very good mental shield, admittedly, but Zorian was still skeptical that the man could help him in that regard. And he was also more than a little baffled that Svim was even willing to help with that, even if it did turn out that he was some kind of mind magic expert. He thought the man was all about the shaping exercises and other basics. Deciding he was going to have to wait till Monday to see what Svim had in mind, Zorian left the man's office and went off to meet Tinami for their mind magic practice. Well, he technically did not know he was meeting Tinami in particular, but considering that the setup was largely the same as it was the last time around, he told Ilsa about his mind magic and requested a practice partner. He didn't think the identity of the other student was that much of a mystery. And indeed, when he arrived at the assigned classroom, he found Tinami already there, waiting for him. "You are the other mind mage?" Tinami asked incredulously. "Yes," he answered telepathically, causing her to flinch in shock. She narrowed her eyes at him in response. "You're late," she complained. "Sorry," he apologized. Svim unexpectedly decided to extend our tutoring session beyond bounds. "I only managed to get out of it a few minutes ago." "You chose Svim as your mentor?" Tinami asked. "Why?" "I live in Siren," Zorian explained. "That's pretty far from Scioria. By the time Ilsa managed to get to me, all the other mentors had filled their quotas and Svim was the only one left." "Is he as bad as they say?" she asked. "He had me do shaping exercises for 2 hours straight today." "Ouch. Okay, I guess that justifies being a few minutes late," she admitted. "We should probably reschedule our future meetings, just in case this keeps happening." "Probably," Zorian agreed. Not even he knew what Svim would choose to do next, and he had lived through this month many, many times by now. "Anything important I should know before we start?" Just like the last time they did this, Tinami was largely interested in practicing her telepathy and ability to read surface thoughts. She was rather bad at it by Zorian's standards, but she improved rapidly under his direction. As for himself, he mostly practiced tapping into other people's senses with her. He could access the senses of other humans quite easily at this point, but trying to actually function while getting 2 sets of sensory inputs was a massive challenge. Especially if he and Tinami were looking in completely different directions and such. Truthfully, there was very little that practicing with Tinami could offer him that he could not also do with Curiel, Kale or some random stranger, but this way he got to talk to one of his classmates, which was one of his resolutions for this restart. It didn't hurt that cooperating with Tinami could be potentially quite useful, considering who her family was. Also quite dangerous, since they were known to dabble in mind magic and necromancy, but he was willing to take that chance. It was too bad he was essentially starting from scratch with her, though the last time he'd done this with Tinami, he had introduced her to the Urania and they'd overshadowed him in her eyes by quite a margin. Because of that, they'd interacted very little outside their practice sessions. Then again, considering he had simply viewed her as a mind magic practice dummy back then and never even tried to get to know her, he had no right to complain. Now, though, there was no convenient nearby Urania to introduce her to, even if he wanted to he would have to catch her attention in some other way. "Okay, I've just got to ask, where on earth did you learn how to perform mind magic so well?" Tinami asked. "I've been learning these things for years, under some very good tutors, and you're just effortlessly one-upping me in every application of it I can think of." "How come?" "It's a secret," Zorian said bluntly. "Ask me later when we get to know each other better." She quirked her eyebrow at him. "When, huh?" "When, if, whatever suits your fancy. The point is that we don't know each other well enough for me to reveal something that personal to you." "That's fair enough," she sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's really annoying, though. I know I'm not exactly a genius in the field but dash." There was a knock on the door. Zorian and Tinami both looked at each other and shrugged, mystified about who could be knocking on an empty classroom door at this time of day. "I'll go check," Zorian said, rising from his seat. Chances were that it was someone looking for one of them, and knowing his luck that meant they were looking for him. He opened the door, only to find Kiana standing behind it. Hi." Zorian said uncertainly. "Hi," Kiana said, sticking her head inside the classroom quickly in order to see if they were alone. She did a double take when she saw Tinami and gave him an incredulous look. "It's private," Zorian said crankily, preempting any sort of question. He stepped out of the classroom and closed the door behind him so they could have some semblance of privacy while they talked. I didn't say anything, she said, raising her hands in front of her defensively. I just came to tell you that Rainey has finally decided to meet with you again. It's at 10 in the morning tomorrow, at this address. She pushed a folded piece of paper into his hands. I shouldn't have to tell you this, but don't spread this around, okay? Like I'd feed the rumor mill like that, Zorian scoffed, rolling his eyes. Will you be there too, standing guard again? No, but the owner of that restaurant is a friend of Rainey, so don't get any funny ideas, she said. Oh, that reminds me, Rainey wants you to know that this is definitely not a date. Even though it's a private meeting in a restaurant between two teenagers. She smiled mischievously at him. Hey, aren't you supposed to be on your friend's side? He complained. I was just joking, she sighed. Gods, you're just as humorless as she is. Heavens help us if you two really do end up getting together in the end. See you around, Zorian. And then she just turned and left without even waiting for his response. She wasn't really how he'd imagined her to be. Shaking his head, he stuffed the paper with the address in his pocket and went back to the classroom. Sorry for the interruption, he told Tinami. It was a small personal matter I had to. Why are you looking at me like that? No way, she mumbled. I heard you were going after Rainey, but to think you got her to agree to it. However did you do that? I thought that was impossible. I don't have a date with Rainey, Tinami, Zorian calmly assured her. You are jumping to conclusions. Unless of course, she exclaimed. Of course a mind reader could figure out her weak spot. Hey, he protested. Now that's just insulting. I would never violate the privacy of her thoughts like that. Why not? Tinami asked curiously. I would, in your place. Are you sure you want to admit so readily to something like that? Zorian asked incredulously. Please. I don't believe for 1 second you are being perfectly moral and responsible with your mind magic, Tinami accused. You're far too good at it to have developed your powers the legal way. This topic is over as far as I'm concerned, Zorian stated. Why don't we go back to practicing mind magic? You know, the thing we're supposed to be doing. I have to ask though, what is it that you people see in that girl? Tinami asked, completely ignoring him. What does she have that I don't? Is it the red hair? It's the red hair, isn't it? Zorian let his face fall into his hands. And it had been shaping up to be such a nice day, too. Not far from the restaurant where he was supposed to meet Rainey, Zorian sat on a bench and waited. There was no sign of her yet, but that was in no way unusual. He had misjudged the amount of time it would take him to find the place, and was thus a little early. He didn't let it bother him, choosing instead to pass the time by experimenting with his mind sense on the passing crowds, tapping into the eyes of pigeons flying overhead and practicing his shaping skills on the handful of pebbles he had taken to carrying around on his person at all times. Honestly, shaping exercises were kind of relaxing when he didn't have Swim breathing down his neck and being a jerk. He should try finding one that was actually challenging, really challenging, but not Swim's patented "you haven't really mastered this bullshit" and set aside some time to HM. He drew the pebbles currently floating in front of him back to his palm and pocketed them, before leaning over a nearby ornamental bush where his mind senses had detected an extremely faint mental signature. Despite knowing exactly where to look, it took him 2 whole seconds to spot the mantis camouflaged against the leaves. He stared at the bug for a while, before an idea occurred to him. He pointed his palm towards the insect and concentrated, trying to telekinetically draw it towards him without crushing it like a bug. Something that was greatly complicated by the mantis holding on for dear life to the twig it was standing on. He had hoped to surprise it with this sudden maneuver, but its reactions were surprisingly fast for something that had been moving so slowly and ponderously just a second ago. Nonetheless, Zorian wasn't so easily deterred. 5 minutes later, he had finally managed to detach the mantis from the twig without hurting it and was levitating it in front of him. The mantis twisted and flailed around in the air, clearly unhappy with its predicament, but Zorian had established too firm a hold on it for his telekinetic control to lapse just from that. At least until the mantis decided it was finished with this annoyance, then suddenly unfurled its wings and flew off. Oh, right, mantises can fly if they need to. He totally forgot about that. Shrugging, he focused on his mind sense for a moment, checking if Rainey had arrived yet. She had. She was still hidden by the nearby building from where he was standing, but her mental signature was unmistakable. He set off in the direction of the restaurant, and was soon back at the entrance, trying not to stare at the street corner he knew she was going to emerge from. When she did finally round the corner, however, she stopped in her tracks and just sort of stared at him in apprehension instead of coming over to meet him. Honestly, what was up with that? He already agreed with her that it wasn't a date, so what was she apprehensive about? He accidentally turned in her direction, pretended he'd just noticed her and gave her a little wave. She stopped stalling and came over to greet him properly. "Sorry if I'm cutting it a little close," she said. "With most people I know, it's a miracle if they're only 10 minutes late, so I've learned not to be too early to this sort of stuff." "You didn't wait long, did you?" "It was a bit of a wait," admitted Zorian. "But to be fair, I was rather early." "Don't worry about it, I found things to amuse myself with." "Oh?" she asked. "And what would that be, if you're willing to share?" "Nothing too interesting. I was just doing some shaping exercises," said Zorian, retrieving the pebbles from his pocket and making them float in a rotating ring above his palm. "Silly, I know, but it passes the time." Rainey stared at the rotating ring of pebbles for a second before shaking her head, mumbling something unintelligible and motioning for him to follow her into the restaurant. He returned the pebbles to his pocket and hurried after her. The moment he stepped inside the dining hall of the restaurant, he understood the reason behind the restaurant's somewhat unusual name, fearsome catfish, indeed. Hanging from the ceiling of the dining room was a preserved body of a massive catfish, big enough to swallow a grown man whole. An interesting choice of ornamentation for a restaurant. Rainey seemed both amused and pleased that the taxidermically preserved trophy gave him pause for a moment, although he only knew that because of his empathy she neither reacted nor said anything to him as she led him to a nearby table where they took their seats. He half expected Rainey to order a plate full of meat, what with her being a wolf shifter and all, but she actually ordered a grilled trout and a plate of vegetables. Ha! He supposed he shouldn't be so quick to assume, though speaking of assuming things, was he expected to pay for them both? His cynical side was saying yes, since her choice of meal was on the pricier side of things, but then again she was the daughter of a tribal chief. Maybe she had plenty of money and this was perfectly normal for her. Maybe she'd be offended that he's trying to pay for her share of the food and think he's trying to court her after all. "It will take some time for the chefs to prepare the food," Rainey said. "Why don't you tell me about these cat shifters of yours while we wait?" Zorian scanned the other tables in the dining hall for any eavesdroppers. They were by no means the only people in the restaurant, and Zorian kind of thought this was way too public of a location to be having this sort of conversation, but it was mostly Rainey's secrets that were at stake here, so if she felt this was fine, then it was. None of the other diners were paying any attention to them, so at least there was that. He told her as much as he could without bringing up the invasion or information about Rhee's background that he obviously shouldn't know about. Even so, he sincerely hoped that Rainey wouldn't want to speak with Ray after their talk, because he would almost certainly find himself in a bit of a hairy situation if that were to happen. He could scarcely explain how he came by some of his information without admitting he had spied upon the Satchel family in some fashion. "I don't think they intend to harm you in any way," Rainey said once he was done. "They wouldn't be willing to leave you alone with their daughter like that if they did, nor would they let her get attached to your little sister if they meant to make you into a target. Most cat shifters are dishonorable, but they don't target their own neighbors, friends, contacts and the like. They never make trouble in their own territory." Well, Zorian had already known that the various shifter groups are by no means united, but it seemed they weren't even on particularly good terms either. Or at least Rainey's group didn't seem to like cat shifters much. I'm guessing the cat and wolf shifters don't get along, then, surmised Zorian. We hardly ever interact with each other. Our relations are not bad because they're mostly non-existent, said Rainey. I personally think they give the rest of the shifters a bad name, and I know I'm not the only one in my tribe with that opinion. You should watch yourself around your new friends. I know I just said earlier that they are not plotting against you, but that doesn't mean they're not dangerous. Cat shifters are rarely just cat shifters, they are the shifter group that has embraced Icosian magical traditions the most. They especially like to dabble in illusionism, mind magic, scrying and other shady disciplines. I wouldn't put it past them to spy on you in some fashion. I'll keep that in mind, Zorian nodded. I'm curious, though, is that a general thing? Do different shifter groups usually avoid each other? No, not at all, Rainey said, shaking her head. We try to maintain contact with other shifter groups, it's just that cat shifters are, well, it's a long story, and I can smell our meals coming. We'll talk more after we've eaten. She was right, the food was indeed brought over to their table not long after that. And Rainey was either very hungry or an extremely fast eater, because she scarfed down her meal in half an hour flat and then kept giving Zorian impatient looks while he ate his own food at a much more sedate pace. Rude. He refused to hurry up just because of her. All right, said Zorian eventually, setting his plate aside to signal that he was done eating. We were talking about shifter relations. Yeah, Rainey agreed. Well, the first thing you need to keep in mind is that the current image of shifters as some sort of weird mages living on the fringes of normal society is something very modern. Before the flood of Icosian refugees came to the continent and conquered everything, shifters didn't live on the fringes of anything, partly because the rest of the natives hated us and would have never allowed us to live near them, but also because we didn't have to. We had our own tribes and territories to live in. The other natives hated you so much? Zorian asked. Oh yes, Rainey confirmed. Even today, the scattered remains of the original tribes that lived in the region the people you collectively call Kuski can't stand the sight of us. Thankfully for us, they have managed to thoroughly marginalize themselves over the years and no longer have any say in how shifters are treated. That's the good thing that came with the Icosian conquest. The Icosians didn't find shifters nearly as threatening or inhuman as the Altasian natives did. As far as they were concerned, we were just your typical group of over-specialized native mages that they hoped to absorb into their society. But? Zorian prompted. But their attempts to absorb us never quite succeeded properly, Rainey shrugged. We speak Icosian and follow the laws of the land, but most shifter groups have stubbornly clung on to every shred of autonomy and independence that we could. Wolf shifters were the most vocal and successful in that regard. Ah, I see, said Zorian, understanding. And since the cat shifters decided to discard their autonomy in favor of assimilating more closely into the rest of the population, you don't get along with each other. Yes, she sighed. We're not enemies, but they have completely rejected our politics and went their own separate ways. Both sides agree that they've got nothing to say to each other and avoid contact. Zorian hummed noncommittally. Somehow he doubted that the wolf shifters really didn't consider cat shifters enemies. He'd buy the idea that the cat shifters really were apathetic over the issue, but the wolf shifters must be pretty bitter over the other side breaking ranks like that. They were just powerless to do anything about it. So how successful are cat shifters, then? Zorian asked curiously. Very successful, Rainey admitted. Eldamar's government loves to point them out to shifter tribes worried about what would happen to them if they gave up on their traditional rights. It's why they are so reluctant to seriously crack down on them, despite their shady behavior. If the biggest success story of the shifter integration program comes under fire, it would likely cause all those other shifter tribes considering going down that path to back off and dig in harder. Right, totally not enemies. So if cat shifters were so very successful, doesn't it make sense to copy them to some degree? Zorian asked. I mean, I can understand not wanting to be criminals, but what stops you getting yourself some classical mages among your ranks? I'd be willing to bet their decision to acquire Icosian-style spellcasting had a lot to do with their success. What do you think I'm here for? Rainey asked him with a smile. Ah, well, Zorian fumbled. While you're clearly training to be a classical mage, you are a rare exception from what I'm hearing, not the rule. Why is your tribe only sending someone to learn this now? Why not earlier? There is a reason why the shifter group most successful in adopting Icosian-style magic is also the group that cares the least for our traditional rites, she said. While the idea sounds simple in principle, in practice it amounts to opening a backdoor for the central government to influence the tribe. Members trained as mages have a tendency to make power plays and bring the mage guild, and through them the central government into internal tribal disputes when they don't get their way. Ah, nodded Zorian in understanding. And the central government is all about abolishing autonomous groups like yours when given a chance. Yes, she agreed. Plus, the tribal elders are very traditional and often react badly if the new mage shows too many outside influences upon return. Many times the mage simply walked out of the tribe in disgust after a few years of clashing with them. So what changed to make you come here? Asked Zorian. A flash of indecipherable, but decidedly negative emotion welled up in the girl in front of him. Or is that too personal a question? It's not really, no, she said, scowling for a moment before schooling her features. She was annoyed at something, but she didn't seem to blame him for it. I guess there are two main reasons. Ever since the splintering of the old alliance, the centralization policies that characterized its twilight years have been somewhat discredited, lessening the pressure on shifter tribes to assimilate. This makes outsider-trained members less threatening to many in the tribe. On top of that, the recent colonization drive to the Sorokian highlands has many shifter tribes wary, since their lands are directly in the path of settlers. If a group of mages decides to settle inside of our borders, it is not at all certain we could get them to leave without asking the central government for help. Help for which they would demand concessions, Zorian guessed. Well, they are actually obliged to help us in that regard for free, Rainey said. It's their duty. But every time we fail to resolve problems ourselves, we weaken our authority and credibility. If we do it too much, our supposed autonomy will end up being only on paper. So it would be best if we had some of our own mages to handle things. Anyway, those two come together into a situation where the tribal leadership felt we had to acquire some mages of our own, and could afford the risk that comes with such attempts. Zorian nodded and spoke no more of the topic, even though he could tell there was more to it. It wasn't as though Rainey had lied to him. He detected no intent to deceive from his empathy, but there was clearly some factor she didn't want to discuss there. Something personal, he guessed. Something that made her angry and bitter at her tribe, which she otherwise spoke about with pride and reverence. He had a feeling that her coming to Scioria was something of an exile. He asked her to give him a rundown of other shifter groups and she jumped at the chance to change the topic to something else. Shifter politics were surprisingly complex. Aside from cat shifters, the raven and owl shifters had also fully abandoned their tribal roots in favor of assimilation into regular society. They were not quite as successful as cat shifters, but both were doing decently for themselves. The viper shifters had also tried to pursue that path, but theirs was not a successful story. They failed to integrate and were nearly wiped out when they launched a short-lived rebellion during the Splinter Wars. The wolf, deer and boar shifters provided the core of the autonomist faction, which sought to preserve their traditional tribal structure and their special privileges. The bear and fox shifters were aligned with the autonomists, but had been slowly wavering in their support over the years and had powerful assimilationist factions working inside of them. Finally, there were three more shifter groups that stood out from the rest for a couple of reasons. First, there were the eagle shifters, who couldn't accept being ruled by anyone, autonomy or not. They simply transformed and flew off in the direction of the Winter Mountains, where they somehow survived till modern times. How they dealt with such a hostile, monster-infested environment nobody was quite sure, and they wanted nothing to do with the rest of humanity. Not even the other shifters. The second one were seal shifters, who got on the wrong side of Eldamar during the Necromancer's War and were mostly killed off as a result. The survivors left for Ulquin Ebesa along with other losing groups, and were never heard from again. Rainey suspected they wouldn't want to talk to other shifters, even if they still survived in their new home. Finally, there were the pigeon shifters, who were never a tribe to begin with. They were a product of an eccentric mage that managed to get a hold of a shifter transformation ritual and was dedicated enough to create his own shifter clan with it. They were mocked and looked down upon by the other shifters, but Rainey admitted, after some prodding, that they were actually doing quite well for themselves. Being able to turn into a flying animal at will had its uses. "I'm surprised there aren't more attempts like that, to be honest," Zorian said. "There are," Rainey said. "They just tend not to go anywhere. They start well, but then run into problems when the first-generation shifters start having children. If not handled properly, shifter children tend to grow up somewhat dysfunctional. Established shifter groups have centuries of tradition to draw on in this regard. New, experimental shifters are stuck with no guidance and must tread with." Caring about the library pass he hadn't used for months and noticed it was missing, Zorian really doubted he would conclude somebody stole it. Who the hell breaks into people's houses in order to swipe their library passes? All that said, Zorian suspected that if he tried the same trick to access some really deeply restricted section, he would be stopped cold by firmer security. He would have to acquire a top-level pass at some point and test it out near the end of a restart. Right now, though, he had to see just what Svim had in store for him. He pocketed the library pass and approached the door. He frowned. What the hell was happening? This was where Svim's office was located. He was sure of it, had been here countless of times, and everything else was exactly where it should be. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the mental shield snap shut over his thoughts. The compulsion to ignore the door to Svim's office melted away, and his eyes finally stopped skimming over it like it didn't exist. No, now that he thought about it, it was more like he had dismissed it as irrelevant. As obviously not what he was looking for. If he'd been less sure of himself, who knows how long he would have looked for the door before figuring it out. Opening his eyes and forcing down his annoyance at Svim's antics, he knocked on the door and then immediately entered without waiting for permission to do so. He found Svim calmly staring at him, fingers steepled together. "Pitiful," Svim declared. "That such a crude trap managed to snare you, even for a minute, shows how woefully unprepared you are for the dangers of mind magic." "Yes, sir," agreed Zorian easily. He was too inured to Svim's attitude to really get worked up by it anymore. "That is why I professed a desire for a training partner to Miss Salady." Svim waved his hand through the air once, as if warding away a particularly annoying fly, wordlessly letting him know how little he thought of that idea. "I understand, from talking to Ilsa, that you are a natural mind mage, yes?" Svim asked. It was apparently a rhetorical question, because he didn't wait for Zorian's response before continuing. "It is commendable that you are trying to correct your deficiencies on your own initiative. Too many mages with such natural talents mistake their inborn advantage for actual mastery, wasting their potential and putting everyone around them at risk. Even themselves. Especially themselves." Wow, was that actual praise from Svim? Sadly, Svim continued, "Your attempt, much like the shaping skills you displayed at our session last Friday, falls embarrassingly short of achieving actually worthwhile results. It is up to me, as your mentor, to mold you into something resembling a competent and responsible spellcaster." "Ugh. Never mind. I see," he said, somewhat sourly. "Please forgive my impertinence, but I was not aware that you were an expert in mind magic. I thought you taught advanced shaping exercises for fourth-year students." "I also do private lessons for particularly talented first and second years," Svim said, a ghost of a grimace flickering over his face for a moment before he smoothed it into his usual impassiveness. Svim probably didn't think much of their talent. "And, more relevantly, I teach a fourth-year elective dealing with defense against hostile magic." Obviously, this includes mind magic as well. Ah, said Zorian. That did a lot to explain Svim's constant mind shield. Still, I feel I should point out that my innate ability grants me a very powerful and flexible mental shield. Oh. How interesting, Svim said speculatively. Tell me, is your ability purely defensive or can you reach out and touch other people's minds too? The second one, Zorian admitted. That's why I asked Miss Lady for help. I needed a willing target that would let me practice telepathy and mind reading on them. In that case, you probably already know about the mental barrier I'm currently sporting, Svim stated. Well, yes, but not because I tried to access your mind or anything, Zorian lied. It's just that the base form of my talent is a passive form of empathy that tells me what other people are feeling, and I cannot sense anything from you. As far as I can tell, that only happens when they are shielding their minds somehow. I am certain that is the only reason why you know of it, and that you have never even entertained the thought of getting revenge on your insufferable mentor by taking a quick peek at his mind, Svim said indulgently. As it happens, though, I want you to try and invade my mind. Please do your best to get past my mental barrier and tell me how it compares to your own. Oh, this was absolutely perfect. A chance to attack Svim and get away with it. How could he refuse? Still, as annoying as his mentor was, he didn't really want to hospitalize the man, so he didn't immediately launch the strongest mind spike he could form into his unprepared defenses. No, instead he first ran some light probing attacks to see if he could find any obvious imperfections. He couldn't, and then launched a quick succession of weak attacks to gauge the strength of Svim's shield. It was a very solid thing, comparable in strength to what Zorian and the Urania could create, which surprised him a great deal. On the other hand, that meant he didn't really have to hold back. He powered up his strongest, most focused mind spike and slammed it directly into the mental barrier. Though outwardly calm and composed, inwardly Zorian grinned in savage glee as he felt Svim's mental shield crack and buckle under his sudden onslaught. And then the moment passed, and Svim's mental barrier immediately snapped back into place, as perfect and unyielding as it was at the start. Zorian's eyes involuntarily widened in shock. And no way he repaired it. How? He wasn't a psychic, he was sure of it, and no spell he knew of could repair itself. Certainly not that quickly. Zorian couldn't fix his mind shield that quickly. Hell, the Urania he practiced with couldn't make their defenses snap back to an intact state that quickly. He launched 3 more powerful attacks in quick succession with the exact same result. The attacks did damage to Svim's mental barrier, but it was repaired so quickly and thoroughly that a lesser attacker could have been fooled into thinking it had never been damaged at all. He narrowed his eyes. No. No, he was not going to be foiled in this. Brute force wasn't working, but he hadn't been trained by the Urania for nothing. He had far more than that at his disposal. He started executing basic attack patterns taught to him by Mind Like Fire, treating Svim like a fellow psychic instead of a mage using a structured spell, and slowly the limits of Svim's defenses revealed themselves to him. For one thing, Svim did not seem to feel his probing attacks. Anything not strong enough to crack his mental barrier was effectively undetectable to him. Secondly, his barrier was completely uniform. He never reinforced a spot he was attacking, even if he repeatedly targeted the same place over and over again. When he next attacked, he did not use a powerful but momentary mind spike. He picked one part of Svim's mental shield and started crushing it. He didn't let up, and slowly it began to crack under his mental pressure. No repair was possible. His attack was overwhelming the shield's regeneration, widening the cracks and bringing it closer and closer to total collapse. He diverted a few tendrils of power from the main attack into the widening holes in Svim's defenses, causing the man to visibly flinch as telepathic forces seared his surface thoughts. Stop! Svim ordered, raising his hand into the air in a halting gesture. Zorian immediately withdrew, letting Svim recreate his mental defenses and regain his composure. Well, his mentor said, massaging his sinuses. An afternoon headache, just what I needed today. I suppose that will teach me to tempt my students. Nonetheless, it was a fascinating experience. Less classical mind magic, and more akin to something a memory moss, an azure sea hermit crab or a cephalic rat swarm would employ. That wasn't a spell you were using to shield your mind, was it? Zorian asked. No, it was not, Svim confirmed. It was unstructured magic, much like your own abilities. But how? Zorian asked. I can tell that you aren't well, a natural mind mage like me. Mind magic shaping exercises, Svim said simply, as if that explained anything. There are shaping exercises for mind magic? Asked Zorian, surprised. There are shaping exercises for every field of magic, Svim said. They are essential for building a proper foundation around which you can base your spells. Right, stupid question. What he should be asking was how doing shaping exercises allowed Svim to do a reasonable impression of a full-blown psychic. He was a bit of a one-trick pony, but to be fair, it was a very nice trick. I was not aware that doing shaping exercises can give you unstructured magical abilities, Zorian remarked. Really? Svim asked him curiously. What did you think shaping exercises were, if not unstructured magical abilities? Do enough of related ones over the years, and they're bound to build up to something greater than the sum of its parts. In the case of mind magic, the ability to defend against it is so universally coveted that countless training regimens for gaining mental defenses have been devised over the centuries. What I displayed is not a common skill by any means, but is not particularly rare either. Zorian frowned. Come to think of it, a fair number of people he'd encountered in the past had some form of mental defense that didn't really feel like a structured spell. Alanik for instance, as well as Ray. Zack also had some sort of mental shield, according to Spear of Resolve. One she did not feel comfortable tampering with. He really should have suspected something like this earlier. Can you also use telepathy and mind reading in an unstructured manner, too? He asked Svim, acting on a hunch. Me, personally? No. I've never had an interest in anything other than defending myself, Svim said. But if you're asking whether it's possible, the answer is yes with caveats. It requires great dedication for rudimentary results. Such an aspirant would never be able to duplicate the attack you just casually did, for instance, even after a lifetime of honing their skills. He knew it was just like soul sight. Getting a reduced version of the ability that affects only yourself was doable with a lot of work, but reaching out and applying it to someone else was all but impossible. So? Svim said impatiently, breaking his contemplation. The comparison? Right. Your shield seems to give you far less feedback than mine does, it's too uniform in composition and your response to attack is very predictable and exploitable for someone who knows what they're doing, said Zorian, relishing the chance to make Svim on the receiving end of criticism for a change. Svim simply nodded, giving no indication that his pride was wounded by the barrage. On the other hand, your shield has far fewer imperfections and you can repair it a lot faster than me. Well then, Svim said, leaning back on his chair. I guess we know what you'll be practicing today, then, don't we? All right, said Zorian. He was fine with the idea, really. Improving his mental defenses was always welcome in his mind. How is that going to work, though? I don't think any classical mind spell can do much to me, barring surprise attacks like that trap you put on the door. Surprises come in many forms, Mr. Kaczynski, Svim said, reaching into his drawers and retrieving a spell rod, which he promptly pointed at Zorian's face. Allow me to demonstrate. Zorian hurriedly strengthened his mind shield, determined to weather the incoming mental attack Svim was launching at him, but what hit him wasn't a mind magic spell. It was some sort of dispelling wave, and his mental shield evaporated upon contact with it like a raindrop hitting a burning oven. Then the knockout spell hit him. He resisted. He may have been stripped of his mental shield and caught off guard, but he was still an experienced mage and he went through Kiran's resistance training too. The relatively minor spell Svim used could not subdue him. But the point was made, regardless. A proper mind mage, Svim said, would have reconstructed his shield before the second spell had been even cast. Zorian sighed. Of course they would have. Start over, he guessed. Start over, Svim confirmed. In a scene that Zorian would rapidly begin to hate with every fiber of his being, Svim once again pointed the spell rod at his face and blasted his mental shield into oblivion. Following their Monday session, Svim largely replaced their regular sessions with mind magic-related ones, constantly pushing his defenses and giving him long lists of mind magic shaping exercises to try. Most of these exercises were absurdly easy for Zorian, teaching things he already had an instinctive grasp of, but searching the restricted section of the library with his brand new pass yielded some less intuitive ones that actually taught him something new. Besides, his meetings with Tinami weren't really getting anywhere. He wasn't really getting much from them himself, and Tinami basically turned his every attempt at interaction into an interrogation attempt, trying to figure out who had taught him to be as good as he was currently. She also seemed to have blabbed about his meeting with Rainey, since everyone in class seemed to know about it when he came to the academy on Monday. Probably as revenge for refusing to answer her questions. In any case, that pretty much killed any sort of goodwill he may have had with Rainey. She accepted that he was not at fault when they talked later in the day, but she still didn't want to be seen anywhere near him after that. It was probably Benesek loudly congratulating him in front of the whole class that really screwed him over when it came to that. Why did he ever think that hanging around that guy was a good idea? Oh well, live and learn. Seeing how his social endeavors were in tatters for the rest of the restart, he focused his energies on finding the Iranian treasury, his personal experiments, and tracking down and interrogating the invaders. The latter two were doing just fine, but his quest for the Iranian treasury stubbornly yielded no results. He resolved to take the filigree sages up on their offer to take them to the Sciorian settlement in exchange for their help with memory manipulation. Maybe Iranian explorers would be more successful than him, and more help with his memory reading skills was always welcome. He should also save the Yellow Cavern Guardians from their invader again, just in case they had something new to tell him now that he had some actual experience with mind reading under his belt. His invasion-related activities steadily continued as weeks passed, yielding no revolutionary results or critical revelations, but his memory reading skills were getting pretty good and he had found some interesting targets that might actually know something interesting. Unfortunately, his constant attacks had made the invaders cautious and paranoid, and everyone important was always armed and under tight security. Zorian didn't feel confident going after them under such conditions. He would go after them in a future restart, when they hadn't had the forewarning that he was coming for them. As the end of the restart approached, Zorian laid off the cultists a little, limiting himself to raiding their caches and monitoring their activities. The caches held no crucial clue or amazing treasure, but one of them did have a whole lot of cash, which Zorian intended to put to good use in future restarts, and the potion collection he stole at the start of the restart looked promising. Kale claimed he would need another restart to finish going through them, but some of them were clearly advanced combat potions that produced clouds of acidic vapor upon breaking, doused everything in unquenchable fire and similar effects. That sounded quite compatible with Zorian's fighting style, in all honesty. And then, several days before the summer festival, his spying effort finally gave him the alert he had been waiting for. The leadership of the Cult of the World Dragon issued an order to one of their low-ranking groups to kidnap Nachka. It wasn't the same team as it was the last time, nor was the kidnapping scheduled to occur on the same date it had in the previous restart, but his efforts had caught the order anyway. He ambushed them halfway to the Sashel family house, when they were still herding their giant centipedes through the sewers. His initial idea was to seize control of the centipedes and make them turn on their masters, making it look like they lost control of the beasts. Unfortunately, the mage controlling them knew what he was doing. The moment Zorian attempted to influence the minds of the monsters, he clamped down on his control over the centipedes and shouted a warning to the rest of the group that they were under attack. So Zorian used his backup plan and chucked one of the combat potions he recovered from their cache into their midst. The centipede controller, as well as 3 of his centipede minions, died on the spot, frozen solid when the bottle broke and the glittering blue liquid made contact with the air. Alas, that revealed his hiding spot, forcing him to shield himself from a barrage of offensive spells the 3 surviving cultists had started peppering him with. Fortunately, with no more controller mage to contest his control, the last centipede was child's play to commandeer. Before his 3 attackers had realized what was happening, the centipede's venomous fangs bit down on the leg of one of them, and they had to defend themselves from a danger in their own midst. They never stood a chance from that point on, though they had managed to kill the centipede before Zorian finished them off. His task done, he left the scene, wondering what the cult of the World Dragon was going to do now that its plans had been foiled. Were they going to come after Nachka again, with more resources this time? Just how important was she to them, anyway? He supposed he would find out soon. To Zorian's surprise, Nachka was never attacked after that. Instead, the cultists attacked another family the day after that, this time a rather prominent officer serving in Eldamar's military who happened to be one of those pigeon shifters that Rainey didn't think much of. The man and his wife were unharmed, but their 8-year-old son was kidnapped by their unknown assailants and no ransom demand had been issued. Unlike the cultists' attack on the Sashel family, this one garnered a great deal of attention from the newspapers and the authorities. After all, their new target wasn't just some random nobody, but a member of Eldamar's military, and they didn't bother with some flimsy, monster attack setup this time, choosing instead to just barge in and kidnap a kid during the night. Quite a bit more attention-grabbing. So, clearly the cultists needed a shifter, probably a shifter child, for some purpose. Primordial summoning, most likely. They needed one so badly they were willing to kick over an anthill just before the invasion, exposing it to a huge risk of discovery. But it didn't have to be Nachka, apparently. "Hey, Zorian," Kiriel called out, distracting him from his musings. He looked towards her and found her trying to paint a face on the next-generation wooden golem he had made for her. It had a whole bunch of minor improvements over the old one, but Zorian suspected Kiriel only really cared about one of them. The new version had long, brown hair attached to its head, based on her request. Apparently she decided that it wasn't lifelike enough for her. "What?" he asked. "Who are you taking out to the dance tomorrow?" she asked. "It's none of your business," said Zorian. Ugh, he would have to make sure to be out of the house by tomorrow evening, just in case Ilsa sent someone after him again. "Are you going out with the red-headed girl you're dating?" she asked. "And, wait a minute, how do you even know about that?" Zorian protested. "Kale told me," she said, biting the wooden end of her paintbrush for a minute before adding some fine touches on the golem's new eyebrows. Stupid Kale, he probably thought this was all so terribly amusing. "I think you could use a girlfriend," Kiriel said, before turning towards her new golem. "Don't you agree, Kizjenka?" Just as it had been made to do when presented with something that sounded like a question, the golem nodded its head gravely. "See, even Kizjenka Agra-dash." "Kiri," Zorian cut her off. "Yes. Shut up."